Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to ELPC Thinks. I'm Howard Lerner. I'm the Executive Director of the Environmental Law and Policy Center. ELPC Thinks, as you know, is where we bring together experts, environmental leaders, community partners to forge new strategies for progress in the Great Lakes and around the Midwest. And I'm thrilled today that our friend and colleague, Dan Egan, a Pulitzer Prize finalist twice, former Milwaukee Journal Sentinel reporter, reported for years on the Great Lakes and environmental issues, and now the author of The Devil's Element, Phosphorus and the World Out of Balance, is joining us today. Dan is the Brico Fund Journalist in Residence at the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee Center for Water Policy. We're going to have a conversation between the two of us. We'll have some times for questions and answers and responses. Click the Q&A icon on the screen and put in your question. We'll do our very best to try to get to them and make sure that Dan is fully engaged, as I know he will be. So without much more ado, I am thrilled, as I said, for Dan Egan to join us. And Dan, why don't you just start by telling us about what led you to write this book? It's a huge endeavor. The issues are important. Tell us a little bit about it before I plunge in with some questions about it.
Sure. Yeah, thanks for having me. If you can hear a horn right now, that's the noon doomsday horn. It'll be over in a second, hopefully. I'm
All righty.
Harbor of, I'm at the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee School of Freshwater Science, right in the harbor. So there's a lot of noises, nautical noises that sometimes come by. Anyway, yeah, I got interested in phosphorus as a book subject after doing some research for the book that came out in 2017, The Death and Life of the Great Lakes. And there's a chapter in that book on Lake Erie. And that book, that Great Lakes book, really was kind of the sum total of more than a decade's worth of work at the Milwaukee Journal Sentinel. So a lot of it was rehashed material. And I remember as I was looking into the phosphorus issue on Lake Erie that I really wished I was writing a book from scratch, not repurposing old newspaper material. And so when the book came out and it did pretty well enough for the publisher to come back and ask if I had any ideas, I said, well, I'd really like to.
That's a good thing.
Yeah, but I don't know what he thought when I said, yeah, I'd like to write a book about phosphorus. And his first question obviously was why, and who's going to care? And it didn't take long to convince him. It took about a year to convince him to buy this Great Lakes book proposal. And it took him about a week to latch on to this. And so I got my wish. I got to build a book from scratch, which, was a lot harder than I thought it was going to be, especially with COVID.
Well, the Great Lakes book, Dan, gave you street cred, with the publisher. You have plenty of street cred as a journalist. That gave you street cred with the publisher. And your book about phosphorus, what I find so fascinating, it talks about almost the good and evil of phosphorus, that sort of duality of the element's quality and then the impact on the planet. And for those of you who haven't read the book, please do. If you'll enjoy what you hear from Dan today, go out, buy a copy of the book. But what are the quick takeaways from the book? I mean, the good, the evil duality.
Yeah.
What do we need to do now?
I refer to it in the book, I believe, as like the phosphorus paradox.
Right.
And the essence of that is, excuse me, we're burning through this finite resource at an unsustainable pace. And we have been for the last century. And, we've done it because it makes things grow fast and it's been cheap historically. So a little on the field is good. And as the land grant, people used to tell farmers in the Midwest, if a little's good with this stuff, a lot's better. And so we overdose the fields for decades, and that doesn't come without consequences. So the good is it grows food. The bad is it doesn't stop growing things when it washes off those fields and makes its way into water. And Lake Erie is kind of ground zero for this phenomenon with all the cyanobacteria troubles that they've been having. So yeah, I mean, it really was an interesting thing to write. I mean, it's something that we literally, like, it's in every living cell on the planet. It's in when people say something's in your DNA, phosphorus is your DNA. It's the helix, the backbone, the sugar phosphate. So it's absolutely essential, but it's also in a number of ways noxious. It's poisonous. It's a vicious weapon, and we don't have a handle on it. We kind of opened up Pandora's box a while ago, and have never figured out how to shut it. We need to keep using it. We just need to use it smarter.
So talk a little bit about what you refer to as the circle of life with regard to phosphorus,
Yeah.
how it got broken and basically turned into the circle went into a straight line.
Yeah, I mean, if you think,
Tell everybody what you mean by that.
okay, I'll try to keep it simple. Think of a forest, and a forest pretty much historically, naturally took care of itself. It just kept regenerating new trees generation after generation after generation. And soil, has essential things in it that can get depleted when things grow. And you might wonder, well, then why? How could a forest or a prairie self-sustain like that? And it was the circle of life. Trees would grow, trees would die and decay, return to the soil all the nutrients that they had used in their life, and provide ample resources for the next generation. Now, when you think about a crop, what happens there? Like a cornfield, corn grows and then it gets chopped down, but it doesn't get to just sit there in the field and decay and become one with the field again. It gets taken away. So the soil gets depleted of its key nutrients, the three primary ones being phosphorus, nitrogen, and potassium. And so soon after agriculture started, people figured out that they needed to do something to keep the land from deteriorating to the point where it couldn't grow anything. And so they just kind of intuited that dead things had to be returned to the land. And whether that was corpses or manure or hair, blood, I mean, the English were throwing everything they could think of onto their crops to get them to grow. And they struck on one substance that was really potent, and that was bones. But yeah, I mean, the circle of life, phosphorus is, Isaac Asimov referred to phosphorus as life's bottleneck. And that's the way it worked until humans entered the picture. Very small amounts of it trickled out of their rock lockups. The original phosphorus that we have on Earth came in the form of igneous rocks, and those would weather and they would drip their phosphorus into the environment. And as life took hold, that life would take hold of that. And it was used over and over and over. That was the circle of life defined, and phosphorus was the big link. And then once we figured out that phosphorus could keep a field very productive for, not just years, but generations, we started hitting the fields really hard with phosphorus and not returning natural sources as often as we had previously.
You know why I love your reference to circle of life? It's because phosphorus is in some ways simple, but it's really complicated stuff, as your book explains. But we have a generation of people who grew up with the Lion King, the circle of life.
Yeah.
And it enables, a generation or two of people to sort of say, okay, I sort of get what he's talking about here in a frame that people know. I mean, I think, clever, accurate, but it enables the book to be more accessible for people who might not otherwise be steeped in policy like, we are at ELPC and the Alliance for the Great Lakes and our other good colleagues.
Yeah, that was the goal. And that circle. So we didn't just break that circle. We broke it and stretched it and bent it into a straight line. So the phosphorus they used to recycle into the crops over and over, into the trees over and over, now hits the field. And if it gets taken up by a crop, great, it goes to market and the phosphorus is deposited somewhere else. If it doesn't, too often it washes into the water. And so that line really runs from field to water to pollute.
So talk a little bit in part 3 of your book. You talk about the future of phosphorus. And some of the potential technological and cultural changes that can help put the circle back together. At ELPC, we always say, whenever we say there's a problem and we're going to work to deal with the problem, here's what we see the solutions are being. Because, everybody can throw stones at problems. You actually have to come up with solutions. And here, part 3 gets to it. So talk a little bit about technological change. Talk about cultural change. How do we get that circle back together?
Yeah, and I do offer some paths forward in that final section of the book, but I was also careful not to make this a prescriptive manifesto or something saying we need to do this, this, and this.
The Egan manifesto. Okay.
Yeah, I have a history degree. What do I know? But I will say the first step, I think, is to get people to see the picture that phosphorus isn't meant to, it's not a one and done substance. It's meant to be recycled over and over and over again. And there, they used to, as I was explaining with the forest analogy, whether or not that worked, it used to happen naturally. Now what we have is unnatural, but we could stitch something back together. We're never going to be back in perfect phosphorus balance. I don't think we ever were as a planet, but we were much closer to it. But we need to think about how to reuse this stuff. Primarily, I think the big piece of low-hanging fruit here, if you will, is manure, livestock manure. Too often that stuff is, just looked at as something to get rid of. I was talking about what the British were willing to do to put on their crops a little bit ago. If they would see one of these modern CAFO manure lagoons, they would not look at it as a big pile of yuck. They would see it as yum. They would see it as the nutritional trove that it is. And that's a big problem we have right now. I know it's used and spread on fields, and in some cases it's a great balance, and it's cheap, it's accessible, and it solves the problem of the farmers needing to move their manure off their operations. But too often that manure is put on fields, whether those fields need it or not. And in that case, it's just being flushed away. And that's just, it's a shame. It's a shame because, we are running low on US phosphorus reserves. It's been estimated that the primary reserves down in Florida could play out in 3 or 4 decades. So what do we do after that? We're likely going to become dependent on other countries. And you think about energy security, that's a big deal, but there are workarounds to oil. There are no workarounds to phosphorus, and 80% of the world's reserves, as it's understood today, are in Western Sahara and Morocco. So, we've got a day of reckoning coming. And if we could figure out how to better use this manure.
Recycle and reuse.
Yeah, but
That principle.
Processing it so it could be pelletized or put in granular state so it could be shipped out of watersheds to, from watersheds deficient in phosphorus or lousy with phosphorus to watersheds that are deficient with it. So not only tackling the manure problem does 2 things. It sustains or prolongs our rock deposits of phosphorus, which are limited, and it protects water. And I don't know which is more important. I think they're equally important.
They're both important.
Both are accomplished doing the same thing, and that is recognizing phosphorus as an asset rather than a waste.
On that both asset and liability side, my colleague Rob Michaels here at ELPC has devoted the last couple of years of his life and work to dealing with CAFOs and manure. Manure is the fastest growing source of phosphorus that gets into Lake Erie. It, along with overuse of fertilizers, causes toxic algae blooms, as you point out in your book, almost every summer. And indeed last year extending through to November. I mean, the toxic algae outbreak problem is getting worse rather than better. And ELPC is in the forefront of the litigation, the policy work to try to change and fix that. So what do we do with the existing CAFOs? How do we get them? Do you have examples of CAFO operators or others who are taking some of the technologies, taking some of the ideas you're talking about, and are sort of success stories, putting it into play?
I didn't explore a lot of that in the book. As my editor said, it's a book about phosphorus, so we don't want to go too long. But there are obvious things we can do, and I think legally, bureaucratically, it starts with this exemption, largely an exemption from the Clean Water Act for the non-point sources. Those farms are by definition point sources. When you fly in a plane or look from a satellite image and you see the size of these lagoons, what could be more of a point than a big sloshing lagoon full of manure? And,
we agree with you. These are under the Clean Water Act. Whether phosphorus comes in from an industrial facility or comes in from a large agricultural operation, it should be viewed and treated legally as a point source for the reason you've said and the structure of the Clean Water Act.
Yeah, and in a way, if you want to be an optimist, and I always do, the big agriculture solved half the problem. If the first step in pollution control is getting your hands on it, consolidating it, putting it in a place where it can then be treated, and they've done that. out of expediency. And
Dan, our colleague Bob Riley, who's on this webinar, does an enormous amount of work on agriculture in Iowa, says that in Iowa, there's enough animal manure to satisfy 25 to 30% of the nutrient needs for corn and soybeans. And that if it's just managed better, you can export corn and soybeans that contain, in effect, the phosphorus. How is that part of a solution in your view?
How is repurposing or repackaging this manure? And I mean, is. Go ahead.
Yeah, what Bob is saying is, look, if you manage it right, that supplies nutrient needs of the corns and soybeans.
Absolutely, and that's where we've got to go. And it seems to be a pretty obvious point to me. I understand the rationale for the exemption back in 1972 because the big polluters were industrial, and agriculture was conducted in a different way and on a different scale back then.
Right.
It was.
These are not mom and pop family farms. These are huge industrial operations.
Yeah, and that 25 to 30%, could supply the nutritional needs of the crops of Iowa. I've seen some stuff. I may be misremembering it, but Jim Elser over out at University of Montana and Arizona State, he said, I believe that if we got super efficient, we could supply 50% of our crop fertilizer via animal manure. And then there's the human manure component, which I think is important, mostly I think socially, just so people start thinking about this and recognizing that we can't live in this use it once, throw it out kind of mentality that worked very well in the 20th century, 19th century. But it's going to become apparent pretty quickly that it's not going to work deep into the 21st century.
Dan, a couple of questions from Harry Drucker, Jeff Potter, same theme. Planting sunflowers, planting bushes on the edge of fields. Is there a way to do that helps absorb the phosphorus and takes it out of the waterways?
Yeah, so here in Wisconsin, we have some pretty progressive phosphorus discharge rules. And because of the Clean Water Act, in a lot of ways, state regulators' hands are tied. So I'm sure you're aware, I'd imagine you're aware, or some of the listeners are, what's going on up in, say, Green Bay, Wisconsin, where the wastewater treatment plant.
Good. Let's talk about Green Bay. That's where I was going next. Go for it.
Yeah, well, so because the phosphorus diet, essentially the TMDL that they've put on the lower bay of Green Bay is so stringent, it requires a lot of further reductions from industries and municipalities via wastewater treatment plants that have already invested over decades, hundreds of millions of dollars on phosphorus capturing systems. But because the law only addresses these polluters, they're on the hook to ratchet down their discharges even further, even though that may result in no appreciable water quality improvement in Green Bay. So what Wisconsin regulators are doing, they're trying to get farmers and wastewater treatment plant operators together. And it's kind of like a phosphorus trade model where the wastewater treatment plants, or the taxpayers, the users of these wastewater treatment plants, essentially pay farmers not to pollute. And how do they do that? Well, obviously it's taking land out of production, but the more practical things that they're doing are what you were talking about. Buffer crops, cover crops, just planting further away from streams and rivulets, just best management practices that we've had that toolbox at our disposal for a long time, but it's all voluntary, and that's the problem. So it's not so voluntary once money comes into the equation, because that kind of corrupts the voluntary nature of anything. But it's a step in the right direction. I just think, in some ways, if I'm a toilet flusher in the city of Green Bay, which I was for the first 18 years of my life,
I'm going to ask you about Green Bay in a minute.
I'm wondering if why am I paying the farmers to farm smartly?
You're subsidizing it.
Exactly.
It's becoming a taxpayer subsidy. Actually, at ELPC we talk about the polluter pays principle, and the system is at present, which is paying agricultural operators lots of money to do things that they shouldn't be doing, is sort of the antithesis of that. And the voluntary program, as you're describing, in Ohio, Scientist Jeff Reuter has said it's basically not going to work to solve the problem. And let's compare and contrast Lake Erie and Green Bay for a second. In Lake Erie, one of the problems, of course, is that you have tile drainage. So it's not just a matter of putting up buffer crops. You wind up having the manure gets into the groundwater, which goes down the tiles and goes into the tributaries of the Maumee, gets into the Maumee River and goes to Lake Erie. I've always thought that Green Bay, to some extent, is a little bit easier to solve just because you don't have the extensive tile drainage. But in your book, you talk about you were a kid, you grew up on Green Bay, and you've sort of watched what happened. And just talk a little bit about what you've seen and sort of how it feels.
Yeah, well, so yeah, I grew up in Green Bay, and so did my grandpa. And he was born in 1910. And
Wow.
I remember him telling me stories of how they used to take a trolley out to Bay Beach, which is at the mouth of the Fox River, where it spills into Lower Green Bay. And there was a swimming beach out there, and they would go swimming. Well, there's been no swimming beaches within a bike ride of Green Bay, the city of Green Bay, open swimming beaches, since the 1950s. And it's because of the heavy pollution. And a lot of it wasn't phosphorus, it was industrial excrements kicked
Right.
out. That Fox River is as hard a working river as the Maumee.
Right.
It's a lot of paper and pulp mills. So that it wasn't just a case of phosphorus. But when I was a kid, yeah, we used to play along the Fox River, and my parents were always warning us to stay away, and they weren't so much afraid that we were going to drown because we're all excellent swimmers. We're just huck finning around down there, but
Yeah.
it was a dump, and my parents knew it. We used to pick clumps of sulfur off the riverbank, and we thought of it as like this low-grade firework because you could light it and it would ooze like lava, kick off this stench. And I remember thinking, oh, this is nature's bounty. We get free fireworks. We don't have to go buy snakes and smoke bombs and whatever else we were lighting in the 1970s. It was
Don't get me going on everything goofy thing I did as a kid. But interesting, just to compare and contrast the experience. And I live on the far north side of Chicago, a mile and a half from where I was born. Lived in the city and the suburbs, and I spent my time in Lake Michigan. And growing up in along Lake Michigan, it's what you're describing, filled with industrial pollution. It was cruddy to swim in. And we've now seen the success of the Clean Water Act. The industrial facilities, and you've written eloquently on this, have reduced, well, they're no longer dumping, toxic sludge directly into Lake Michigan, or at least they're not doing that legally. And the lake is a lot cleaner. It's safe to swim in. It's good. The beachfronts are packed with people who are out there swimming in the summer, enjoying it. And if you have a period of time, having grown up along Lake Michigan, and you live there today, you've really seen it getting cleaner, it working. Yeah. And that's what's so frustrating about what you're describing about Green Bay, and what you're describing in your book about Lake Erie. We know how to make things better when we put our minds to it.
Yeah.
Let's do it.
So, when all these regulations were coming online, Green Bay is such a mill town, and I lived in a mill house. The complaint was, we're going to get driven out of business. Well, guess what? People need toilet paper. They really need it. And they're going to figure out a way to make it so it's not going to ruin the economy. And they did. And many of those mills are still thriving. People need, I guess it's a stretch to say they need dairy. Well, they do. They need stuff about dairy. But we still need, we need cows to produce. We don't want to run them out of business. We just want them to run the business in a way that's compatible with, fresh water. And the only thing more important than food, arguably, well, I guess biologically, is water. And they're not mutually exclusive. And I think you're absolutely right. Looking back at the past and the hurdles that industry, the money industry had to jump through or spend to clean up their act, and the public's water worked. And, there's plenty. You go to the Fox River today, and when I was a kid, there were kids down there, but there was nothing much going on. Now, you have these walleye fishing tournaments where you could walk across that river, which is probably maybe a half mile wide, over a quarter mile wide, from boat to boat. It's just packed. And, that's an economic engine as much as those smokestacks are. And we know that. And we're just kind of ignoring that when we talk about what we need to do with the livestock industry to make sure that, we have safe water for tomorrow and for generations to come. One of the really frustrating things I found when I was writing this book was that annual algae bloom. I call it algae bloom. I know it's algal bloom, but normal people call it algae, and this is a book for normal people. When they do the bloom forecast every late June or early July, and I went out. It was on one of the islands of Lake Erie, and it was such a wet. This is 2019 or 20, I can't remember, but it had been such a wet spring that they were saying, a lot of farmers couldn't get out onto their fields to apply fertilizer. So they were predicting the bloom to be like a 6 out of 10 or something. I don't remember what. Nobody in the room that day mentioned that they just like the week before the state of Ohio approved like a 45 head expansion of a pig farm right in the basin. So it's just defies common sense, and it offends common sense when you have all this money being spent, H2O highway or whatever it is. That's all great, but money doesn't always solve problems. Rules and regulations do. Nobody in the room even brought this up that day. Nobody said, excuse me, how can things get better when they're manifestly getting worse on the input end?
Well, people talk about carrots and sticks. And one of the problems in Ohio and this is what ELPC does every day with our colleagues, is over focus on carrots and unwillingness to use the sticks. I'm not saying there isn't room for carrots, but there's got to be a better balance. And it's your point, and it's Jeff Reuter's point as well. If all you're doing is carrots, the price tag goes up enormously on the taxpayers, and it simply doesn't solve the problem. You have to have targeted, focused, enforceable regulations, and the sticks go with the carrots.
Yeah, or real big carrots that you can
You were talking about writing a book that's both complicated and trying to communicate it in terms that, as you put it, real people can understand. There's a question from a couple of people in the Q&A, and essentially they're saying, you have a deep understanding of phosphorus and you understand the effect on the environment. How do you balance writing for a general informed audience, but also maintaining the complexity of the issue? Just talk a little bit about the writing process and how you try to get that balance point.
Well, you got to depend on the kindness of strangers. And by that, I mean, like I said earlier, I have a history degree. I don't have a science background, but I've cultivated relationships with people over the years, with scientists. And so I've learned to work with them. And, sometimes it comes down to working with a few and triangulating and saying, I want to be able to explain this way, will this work? And, one will say yes and two will say no, and you massage it and you just try to figure out. But always in my mind is I'm writing for somebody who, like myself, didn't know how to spell phosphorus when I started working on this. I kept putting a U at the end of it.
You put an F at the beginning or something?
Maybe at the end. So you always keep in mind, I came up on the newspaper side, so you really assume no technical background of any reader who opens up a newspaper. So that's the point from which I start. And I also realize that this, it's intimidating right now sitting here talking to you and your audience there, because I would normally not be at the table with you guys because I don't have this legal or scientific background, but I am like a communicator. And so I see my role. Sometimes maybe this is just deluding myself, but sometimes not having that technical knowledge is an asset when you're trying to communicate the issues to a lay audience, because you can see things with their eyes. So it's not easy. It takes a lot of time and a lot of generosity on the part of a lot of scientists and others to do it. But in the end, I try to make it a story. And this was a particular challenge because, boy, when I would tell somebody that I was working on a book about phosphorus early on, I would just get this blank stare, like I was diagnosed with something unfortunate. And then, that really compelled me to really to start like this whole book. I knew I had to start with a bang. You had to come out of the gate hard, because if it's, somebody on your birthday hands you a book and it's about phosphorus, I mean,
You're the life of the party.
Yeah. Well, but when you start telling stories about this, it does become interesting. I wanted to open the book by making my own elemental phosphorus. By the first guy to do this in the 1600s cooked vats of urine, and I thought, I can try that. I got a father-in-law. He's recently deceased, but he was a chemical engineer who worked on ammonia production catalysts for fertilizer. And he's this cranky old English guy, and he's like, "I'll come on up." He was living down in South Carolina. Like,
I love it.
He's like, "I'll come on up." And he's like, we may not get close, but it'll be worth a go. And then I remember him saying, "We're not going to fry the turkey this year, are we?" Because I was getting like turkey fryer. I said, "Of course not." But then I learned from talking to a guy at Johns Hopkins, it's like very dangerous. And it's nigh impossible to do. And the closer you get to blowing yourself up. But I thought that'd be a good way to start the book. Not blowing myself up, but trying to make some elemental phosphorus. I ended up having to go in a different direction. But I'm always trying to keep a lay reader, just I think I like my mom or, family members, just people who really don't give a flip about phosphorus, how to make them think about it.
A couple of questions. I'm going to just try to weave them in here. Pace in it and Gregory McIsaac are asking, can you talk a little bit about recycling phosphorus? Are there ways that you explain in the book, pretty complicated stuff, but how feasible, how realistic is it to, whether it's a wastewater treatment system or otherwise, to extract and utilize, recycle, reuse, and get it out of the lakes, whether it's Green Bay or Lake Erie?
Well, they say information wants to be free, and I think phosphorus wants to be recycled. That's what it's built to do. It's every time we use it, it's not going anywhere as long as we manage it accordingly. And in some ways, I think we've done so much with wastewater treatment, the human waste stream, but there's a lot more we could do. But as I was saying earlier, I think that's important just so it gives people a sense of the connection to their food. The idea that we don't use this stuff once and toss it away. When you move on from that to like livestock operations, although I will say, so this book starts essentially in Hamburg, Germany, where phosphorus was discovered, and then it moves on to Hamburg being burned to the ground by phosphorus bombs in 1943, once the Allies got back on their feet and in their planes and went back across the English Channel to exact some revenge, which is exactly what that was. And then today, one of the world's state-of-the-art phosphorus recovery plants at a wastewater treatment plant is rising on the shore or the banks of the Elbe River right in downtown Hamburg. And they're doing this for two reasons. Germany's got a law coming on the books by 2029 that wastewater treatment plants have to virtually eliminate. I mean, it's hard to get to 0.000, but to virtually eliminate any phosphorus discharge from wastewater treatment plants. And they're doing that to protect water quality, but they also see it as a strategic asset because Western Europe in general, doesn't have many, if any, phosphorus deposits. So this will help wean some of that dependence on other countries. So it's really interesting that the Germans, I mean, this story really does come full circle, starting in Hamburg and ending in Hamburg. The process to do this is super complicated and it's proprietary. I got what I could out of a guy, his name is Martin Lebeck, but they're basically burning the waste and then soaking it in phosphoric acid, which releases more phosphoric acid. So it's like coffee grounds, and you keep pouring water on it and you can keep getting more and more out of it. Kind of like that.
Well, let me shift to a different question. Jim Deering, speaking of communications, professor, former dean of the College of Communications at Michigan State, is asking about anaerobic digesters. And I know it's pretty controversial within the environmental movement. Talk a little bit about your reactions to, are there ways of using anaerobic digesters in which they can really take out more of the phosphorus in the manure?
I don't know the technical process to accomplish that, but I was blown away Earlier this year, when the Milwaukee Journal Sentinel, my old newspaper, had a story about anaerobic digesters up in northeastern Wisconsin because of the subsidies coming out of California for the methane
Right.
production. And maybe those aren't sustainable, but I don't know if you saw this, but they were talking about, in some cases, farmers can make more money off of their manure than they can off their milk because of the incentives to do this. So I think the digesting, that's really a separate issue, but it's not, in that it's like it's deriving it from the same stuff, the stuff being manure. And so it was Lana Pollock told me one time, and it's in the book. I don't use her name because I didn't take notes at the time. I just remember her saying it. She's like, we've got to get to the point where we're looking at this stuff as a resource instead of a pile of waste. And with this digesting, I think that's helping us get to the point, and there can be side benefits, and that would be harvesting or capturing the nutrients, phosphorus, nitrogen as well.
Yeah, Keith Schneider, former New York Times reporter, you know, Keith, now at Circle of Blue, has written a lot about the Farm Bill and the Federal Infrastructure Act subsidies to digesters. And there's a lot of pro and con in terms of how it helps and doesn't. And Keith is, you know, that's one where I think there's a real audience for your writing more and Keith writing more on that and others.
Yeah, it just, you know, you think about what it took in the 1960s to get the Clean Water Act and to get the Great Lakes water, bless you, or to get the Great Lakes water quality agreement. And that was really an informed public because the scientists had a pretty good idea of what was going on with Lake Erie, what was causing those algae blooms at the time. But, you know, it took a picture, and that's what I hope this book is kind of a picture, but it took that picture up in the experimental lakes area up in northwestern Ontario in the early 70s when this is simplifying it, but they basically took a lake, peanut shaped, cut it in half with a polyurethane curtain. And at the time, the detergent industry was saying, look, this phosphorus is not causing the algae blooms, maybe carbon and maybe nitrogen and maybe a host of industrial wastes. But we're not going to take the blame for this. And so they turned this lake into an oversized test tube, and they went up in a helicopter a couple of weeks later, and the side that got phosphorus was, you know, green as an Augusta fairway. And the side that just had nitrogen was as blue as a Canadian lake up in the Northwoods that you would expect it to be. And once they had that picture, they could take it to legislatures and to meetings and say, look what we're doing, and look how it's happening. And that's what we need to get to here. We just need to activate the public because, you know, they're already paying the price for, and I'll call it, it's kind of a sloppy enterprise we have right now. It could be much more elegant, much more tuned to recycling everything we can out of the manure. But doing business the way we're doing it, it may be cheap in terms of the price for a gallon of milk, but we're paying for it in Toledoans being afraid to drink their water or not being able to drink their water in that extreme case back in 2014. Or more widely, going to the beach on a July day in Mummy Bay State Park or anywhere on Lower Green Bay, and you can't go in the water. That's a real price. It doesn't show up on a ledger, but it takes some quality out of your life, and doesn't have to be that way.
Speaking of longtime communications professionals, Jim Lenfesty has a question for you about just compare and contrast a little bit about the battles up and down the Mississippi River, epic battles between advocates for buffer strips and holding off runoff pollution, reduced tiling, and sort of entrenched farming practices.
Yeah, you know, when I was reporting this, just pre-COVID, I went to the Iowa State Fair where all the presidential candidates have to take their turn, all of them, most of them, take their turn on the soapbox, which is like the size of a dining room table. And they just stand there and they take questions from the audience. And I had actually been on Lake Mendota the day before. It was early August. It was 2019. I'd been over there talking to Steve Carpenter at the University of Wisconsin Center for Limnology and some of the graduate students. And, you know, nobody was going in the water because it was poisonous and it's just riddled with microcystis. So I went from there. I drove straight over to Des Moines and started finding, well, I found the two I really wanted to, Elizabeth Warren and Joe Biden, and asked them what they think about ethanol. And that's one, talk about low-hanging fruit right now. if you want to be president of the United States, you pretty much have to pledge allegiance to ethanol because you want to do well in Iowa, and that is big money in Iowa. Even Al Gore, now he'll say that it was a mistake, but back in 2008, whenever it was, he said that he subscribed to the whole program because he had a certain fondness for the farmers of Iowa for obvious reasons. So that's frustrating. But and then when you think about 40% of the corn being grown in the United States going toward ethanol, I mean, that's Dr. Seuss kind of stuff that we're taking food out of the ground and out of people's mouths and putting it in our gas tanks for a dubious fuel of dubious value. But let me just go on here. So that year, that 2019 was like the wettest year in the Mississippi River Basin, maybe some months of 2018, 12-month period, wettest 12-month period on record. And that meant a lot of water going down the Mississippi into the Gulf. And that meant a lot of nutrient pollution. And a lot of people that I talk to who aren't really familiar with this issue don't understand that nitrogen really drives the Gulfstead zone and that it's not really so much a phosphorus issue. But that year it was, because it was so wet, so much water was coming out down at New Orleans. It was drifting east along the Mississippi shoreline, and it basically turned it fresh water. I can't remember the numbers. I think seawater is typically like 30 parts per thousand salt. And I talked to a guy in Mobile Bay. He was all the way over in Alabama. He was 10 miles out one day and got a reading of 5 parts per thousand salinity. It was basically fresh water. I remember the word he used to describe it was bonkers.
It's good.
But that wasn't just water. That had a lot of phosphorus in it. And so all of a sudden, this freshwater scourge starts turning up on Mississippi's beaches to the point where in late June that year, they had to close the beaches to swimming. And I don't know if you've ever been in Mississippi in June or July or August, but it's hot.
It's hot.
Beaches are a good place to be.
Yes, it's hot. It's warm.
It's warm. So I encountered this guy who had bought a fleet of jet skis. He's a longtime jet ski renter, but he had bought a new fleet expecting a bumper season, banner season, and then the beaches got closed and he had to take those jet skis. He hadn't done it when I was talking to him, but he was preparing to take them to Georgia to sell them because he had loans to pay. And we were just talking about, he knew what was going on with what, they were opening the Bonnie Carey Spillway, where they basically let the Mississippi take a left-hand turn right before New Orleans and go out to the Gulf. And that thing was open for a record time that year. And they recognized that that was the source of this pollution. So he was saying, why in the heck am I being regulated out of business when the people causing the problem aren't? And that really brought it home to me. Yeah. And how it's all connected. And it is.
Right, Dan, we're going to move to wrap up, but I got to ask you one thing.
Yeah.
When we started half an hour or so ago, you talked about while you were writing your Great Lakes book, that's how you came up with the idea of the phosphorus book. Mm-hmm. All right. What's the next book?
I don't know. It's like asking my wife if we're going to have another kid right after having one, which we're not. I do plan on writing something. I'm really interested in ice right now, but it hasn't really crystallized yet. So, but I intend to keep writing about water and, based from a Great Lakes perspective. But yeah, that's where I am right now.
All right. Thank you to Dan Egan. And the book is a wonderful read. It's a little hard. It's challenging. It's important. I'll urge you, buy a copy, borrow a copy. I'm sure Dan would like you to buy a copy, as would his publisher. It's well worth reading. Thank you to Dan Egan for joining us today. Thank you for what you're doing, Dan, to highlight the problems and the extent and the importance of the solutions, whether it's Green Bay or Lake Erie or the whole Great Lakes. And stay in touch with us at ELPC. Yeah. We're posting this webinar. You can share it with friends and keep things moving. Thank you very much for joining us.
Thanks for having me. Have a good day.
You're on. I'm glad you could do it, Dan.